This is Diane Stanitski. I'm a physical scientist in NOAA's Global Monitoring Division in Boulder, and I'll be co-presenting today with Chris Cox. Chris is here in Boulder as well in the Physical Sciences Division, and he works with CERES as listed on the screen, and Dave Douglas is in Alaska. He is with USGS, the Alaska Science Center. So I'd also like to acknowledge our other co-authors, and they have played a major role in this, especially Bob Stone, who's been conducting research in Alaska, specifically in Barrow, for decades now. But what we're doing with this presentation and with this analysis is taking an integrated approach to examining the primary drivers of snow melt in Barrow, Alaska, as well as on the North Slope of Alaska. And we're looking at many independent variables that are affected by the length of the snow-free season, including meteorological and radiative, ecological, and biogeochemical variables. And we're not only looking at the anomalous spring observations, as the title mentions, but we're also looking at long-term data sets to show the correlation of snowmelt patterns with other environmental factors. Okay, I'm going to advance. I don't see my cursor.
Diane, it's that in the bottom left-hand corner, the down arrow.
Right, I'm just looking for my cursor, and here it is. Got it. Thank you. Okay, the location for the analysis is Barrow, and the region of focus is the North Slope of Alaska. As you can see on here, I don't know if you can see can you see my cursor?
Usually we can, but this time we can't. I'm not sure why. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. In the upper center part of the slide, you can see winds in Barrow are predominantly from the east-northeast, and that will play a role later when we talk about some of the upcoming slides. NOAA has a baseline observatory, NOAA's Global Monitoring Division, as is pointed out here on this slide. It's been there since 1973, and there are many comprehensive data sets that have been collected, including the date of snow melt in spring. We're also referring to it as the snow out date, and that's been tracked for decades. It's based on radiometric measurements that are made over open tundra at the Albedo rack, and that's shown in the upper left-hand corner. And the snow out date is recorded when the surface albedo drops below 30%. So that's sort of the center, the focus of our presentation today, but we're also looking at independent time series from two other sites in the area. One is the Isotoic Lagoon, located just outside of Barrow, and the other is Cooper Island, southeast of Barrow. And in Cooper Island, we've been looking at the date of the laying of the first egg of a bird species, the black guillemot. So we'll be talking about those and the long-term data sets associated with those. And I'll turn this over to Chris Cox.
Thanks, Diane. So to contextualize this presentation, to kick it off, I'm showing here on the left side three time series beginning in 1975. Now, 1975 isn't an entirely arbitrary point here. This is the mid-70s is coinciding with a climate shift, a regime shift in the North Pacific associated with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And it was sometime in the mid-1970s that Bob Stone's earlier papers reported that this trend towards earlier spring snowmelt at Barrow, that's the top panel, began. Those records went through the early 2000s. And here we've extended it through 2015, showing a trend that results in 2.1 days per decade of earlier spring. In the second panel is the autumn, so this is the first persistent snow cover, again over the same time period. You can see that this isn't quite linear. There seems to be some low frequency variability, and much of the change that observed over this long-term record occurs from the 1990s into the mid-2000s. But overall, across this time series, this is an increase in the a shift towards later snow onset in autumn of about 2 days per decade also. If we difference these two, an earlier spring and a later autumn, we get the length of the snow-free season, which is shown on the bottom panel, and so that has then increased by about 4 days per decade. So we're going to examine these this perspective in more detail throughout the presentation. So I'll start with the albedo. As Diane mentioned, albedo is being measured by the Broadband Radiation Station at the NOAA Barrow Observatory. Excuse me. This has been since the mid-1980s. And so the albedo is defined as the ratio of the reflected radiance, shortwave radiance, to the incoming. A snow-covered surface has an albedo in range of about 0.8 to 0.85. And then the bare tundra beneath the snow has an albedo approximately 0.15 to 0.25. So the shift in the albedo over the snowmelt period, which occurs quite quickly, as you can see from some of these individual years, is a pretty dramatic shift in albedo that then makes the disappearance of the snow radiometrically observable. The climatology is shown in gray, and then I've highlighted 3 anomalous years in the record. 2002 was the record earliest, that's the green, until recent years, 2015 and then 2016 were also anomalously early. You can see 2016 in particular was anomalously early. And this directly impacts the surface radiation budget, which is shown on this plot. So this is the net radiation for all wave, the long wave and the short wave. In the winter, when the long wave dominates, we have negligible solar flux. We have a system that is representative of a net loss, a cooling of the surface in the long wave. And this is due to a lack of solar radiation and a high albedo. And then in the summer, when the albedo becomes low and solar influx becomes high, we shift to a net gain in the surface energy budget. The surface radiation budget. Those same years are 2002, 2015, 2016 are also 2016, you can see that anomalously early year represents a rapid change towards positive net radiation quite early in the season. That additional flux into the surface is being distributed in various ways. For example, the turbulent fluxes probably respond to compensate for a pretty large proportion of it quite quickly, although a lot of it also is stored in the soil, resulting in a higher surface temperature, a higher soil temperature, and a deeper active layer depth, as we'll see in the next slide. However, sorry, go back one. There's one more thing I wanted to say. If you'll notice later in the season, if you compare the 2015 and 2016, the orange and the blue, that though 2015 was also early and had an increase in radiation in the spring due to the early snow melt, clear skies persisted during that year, which meant that in the middle of the summer, the net all-wave radiation was continued to be anomalously positive. However, in 2016, cloudy skies prevailed, and the net radiation was lower than 2015 later in the summer. This plot shows the soil temperatures for 2012 to 2016. The arrows show the date of the snow melt. You can see that right after the snow melt, the upper layers of the soil express the diurnal cycle quite clearly. And the active layer depth, the maximum active layer depth recorded for the summer, is shown on the right-hand side. That happens later in the year than the time series plotted here. So the date on which the active layer depth reached its maximum is plotted, as well as the depth. And you can see that the depth was deeper in 2015 and 2016. These are anomalously early years compared to the more typical 2013 and 2014. However, that the timing of that maximum depth was more variable. And in fact, that 2016, despite being a very early year, was actually slightly shallower in its active layer depth than 2015. And remember that it's the integrated anomaly across the summer that affects the active layer depth, which is occurring, that maximum is occurring later in July and into August. So recall that 2016 was compensated somewhat by the increased cloud cover. Oh, whoops. Sorry, everyone. Pushed the wrong button. So a quick slide here on biogeochemical cycles, which are also tied to this seasonal cycle. The albedo, again, is shown in the blue time series, and the soil temperatures are shown in gray. So when the snowmelt occurs in spring, the soil temperatures then rise above freezing, and then in the autumn, when the freeze-up occurs, you can see that the soil temperatures are stable around 0 Celsius for an extended period of time. This is known as the zero curtain. This is the time period when the soil is actually freezing and the temperature is maintained at 0 Celsius and energy exchanges are latent. Two biogeochemical cycles are shown here as well. The red is chloroform and the yellow is methane. These are from measurements, multi-decadal measurements from the also made at the Barrow GMD Observatory. For chloroform, the seasonal cycle you get, and in fact, let me back up. These are actually enhancements. So this isn't the seasonal cycle in the concentration. This is the enhancement above the background, and so we get these enhancements from the tundra, and this is coming from the tundra, from southerly flow in chloroform during the summer. And when snow cover arrives, these enhancements are more or less shut off. However, it's different for methane. The enhancements continue into the winter and are really driven more by the timing of the freeze-up of the soil than by the timing of the snow cover. And really the main point I want to make on this slide is that the biogeochemical cycles have complex relationships with the snow cover and soil cycle, and different compounds respond in different ways. So I'm going to zoom out now for a minute and show the longer-term record of snowmelt. The record I showed at the first slide I discussed only showed 1975 through 2015. Now we're going to show the entire 20th century up through 2016. The red X's show points from radiometric data at the DOE's atmospheric radiation measurement mobile facility on Aleutian Point, which began in late 2013. So we have 3 years of points there, and those line up quite nicely with the Barrow data. The Barrow data is radiometric beginning in the 1980s. Before that, we're relying on snow observations primarily from the National Weather Service. Now again, as reported by Bob Stone's earlier work, the trend towards earlier springs really seems to have started sometime in the 1970s, and that's represented by the red line. However, that trend analysis is significantly impacted by the recent anomalies, 2015 and 2016. If you were to remove 2015 and 2016 and ignore them, you would find that it's possible to interpret the post-2000 period, with the exception of 2002, as being a time period that is largely leveled off in terms of this trend. So it remains to be seen whether 2015 and 2016 are true anomalies or if they're representative of some sort of a regime shift. Two other points I want to make about this are, first, that though the uncertainty is larger, a few points in the early part of the record are quite early as well, and early in the season, I mean, as well. which may suggest that that some of the early points, the anomalies that we're seeing in the recent period, are not necessarily unprecedented. And the final point is that you'll notice the anomalies that are early are considerably more extreme than the anomalies that are late. I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Thanks, Chris. So this slide shows the anomalous conditions in Alaska during May of the past 2 years. These were the anomalous years Chris was just talking about. We looked at an array of factors that might contribute to early snow melt during these years. For instance, in 2016, the snow out date was 10 days earlier than the previous record in 2002. So it was a very different kind of scenario. And we looked at factors like snow cover the winter before, and there was actually an average or slightly above average amount of snow cover, so that didn't seem to be a factor. Also in April of 2016, for instance, this year, there were very strong winds over the region, and they were the result of an abnormal high pressure over the Beaufort and the dipole set up with a low to the south, resulting in very strong winds along the northern coast. And we thought that maybe with the high winds, ablation might play a role in decreasing or just mechanical removal of snow, decreasing the amount of snow present. But that didn't seem to be the case based on sonic snow measurements at the observatory. So what we're going to click to the next slide, because here you can see that in May, the circulation changed radically, and there was a dipole on a west-east axis that favored southerly winds well into the Arctic. And it was these kinds of synoptic conditions that are conducive to a number of things happening. One is active sea ice motion that would account for the fracturing of sea ice that took place off the coast of Alaska. And we also were looking at the relationship between the Aleutian Low and how that sets up in the past based on years where we saw that the melting that occurred was very early. So in the lower left-hand corner, you can see a figure that shows the Aleutian Low shifted to the west during years when the melt occurred at least 5 days early in the spring, typically during May. And this was the scenario that set up in both 2015 and 2016, where the Aleutian Low is further to the west, allowing for that advection of warm air into Alaska, resulting in 2 very anomalous years. I'm going to turn it back to Chris now to talk about some of those early factors.
So again, the snowmelt date is plotted since 1975 on the top panel here, and then we're showing the amount of precipitation in winter, the snowwater equivalent in October through February, the early spring and late spring air temperature and cloud cover anomalies, and then the early spring and late spring position of the Aleutian Low, its east-west position, as Diane just discussed. One of the things that jumps out is pretty interesting here is that the amount of precipitation you get in winter is actually not an explanatory variable of when the snow is going to melt, neither in terms of a trend or in the interannual variability. The cloud cover is considerably more complicated. There might be some relationship here, in particular in the early part of spring, but the relationship the clouds have with precipitation, the surface energy budget, is quite complex, and in fact the cloud forcing is shifting over this time period from a net positive in winter to a net negative in summer. So interpreting the relationship and the role of clouds is really quite complicated and is not expressed very well in this plot. However, what does stand out is that the temperature anomalies really appear to be a significant factor in the snowmelt date, in particular throughout the spring, and in particular being related to that position of the Aleutian Low in the later part of spring. Moving on to some corroborative records here. Again, the Barrow snow record is shown in black here, and again the Aleutian Point data is shown in purple. In bright green is a similar metric. Really, it's intended to be the same metric as the black line, but it's derived instead from the NOAA snow cover extent satellite data set of David Robinson's at Rutgers. And this is correlated pretty well with Barrow, but you can see some differences in the interannual variability, which in part is methodology, but is in part also spatial. However, both of these records show similar statistical relationships in terms of trends and variance in the long run. Following the meltdown at Barrow, the black guillemot population on Cooper Island, which Diane mentioned earlier, shows their first egg. The first egg being the beginning of the breeding season, and these birds nest in are cavity nesting birds that are dependent on the removal of snow in order to begin their nesting season, and so they're quite closely correlated with the snowmelt record at Barrow. We're also showing an NDVI start of season from satellite record in dark green, and then later in the summer, that lagoon to the southwest of Barrow melts out, and that is also quite closely correlated with the snowmelt record at Barrow. We have been looking at trends in the temperatures in each month, and what I really want to do is just focus in on October when we see the strongest trend. Now, it's replotted in this slide, so that's the gray line, the trend in October temperature, and then this end of season metric for sea ice to the north of Barrow, which is the timing of the date at which the sea ice concentration averaged over a domain, which we've shown in the next slide, falls below 60%. This shows a remarkably high correlation with the Barrow October temperatures. That cross correlation is 0.91. And that the physical explanation for that is that the prevailing winds at Barrow are from the east around the Beaufort High, so a great deal of the air that reaches Barrow comes from out over the ocean. So the amount of open water to the north of Barrow in October appears to be very influential in the temperatures that we see at Barrow. I'm going to turn it over to Dave now to continue that discussion and move on to some broader scale metrics.
Okay, hi, I'm Dave Douglas. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm a wildlife biologist, and I study wildlife habitat in Alaska, and wildlife habitat and their availability and their quality is very tied to the seasonality in the Arctic here, and snowmelt and the period of snowmelt really kicks off the reproductive seasons and for most animals that migrate to Alaska. The study area that Chris was just talking about, that offshore study area is shown in the map there. It's a big, broad-scale area, biased a little bit to the north and east of Barrow because that's the prevailing direction that the winds come. And that's the area that we quantified the sea ice dynamic in, the seasonal ice melt and reformation and freezing in the fall. And the top line of scatter points there are the ones that Chris showed in the previous graph that had the very high correlation with the snow, with the onset of the snow season in Barrow. That's the period when that study area freezes to a point where it's 60% covered with ice. The bottom line is a similar quantification of the ice. It's in the spring when that study area melts to a point that it's only 90% covered with ice. It freezes completely in the winter. So in the spring, when it freezes to a point of 90% ice cover, that's the date that's plotted in the lower regression in the line plot. You can see that ice melt, the start of season, the ice melt, it parallels very closely with the data from Barrow, the slope and the timing. And of course, you can see the divergence of those two lines. Early in the record, those two lines are about 100 days apart, meaning, kind of that ice, that open water period offshore, about 100 days, now extends to 150 days almost at the end of those lines. A much longer open water season, and that late October freezing, all that warmth from the ocean causing that warmth in Barrow to be recorded. I want to show you just a few quick slides of a big, broad picture of the greater Alaska area. And in terms of the start of season, here, the black line in the top right is the Barrow snowmelt dates, and the green line is a start of season, start of the growing season from NDVI satellite measurements. Those are measured at the site, the study area shown in the upper right, just south of Barrow. But if we look at those data over a very broad landscape in the lower two maps, and the left map is sort of for an early half of the record, 1982 to 1999, and the one on the left, the more recent years, or the right. And basically, if you look at the start of season, how much greenness there is in there, you can see that overall the recent period throughout the greater Alaska area and Russia has that greener tone to it. The start of the growing season is about a week to 10 days earlier on average throughout the Arctic. It's a consequence of those broad synoptic air masses moving and the warmth coming into the Arctic that Diane talked about. The colors out on the sea ice are from data, passive microwave data, that shows us the start of the melt on the sea ice. It's not the sea ice melting, but the actual water appearing in the snows that are on top of the sea ice. The more abundant pinkish areas in the lower right, the recent period, the sea ice is starting to melt, the surface snows kicking off a positive albedo feedback and helping bring a earlier onset to the sea ice melt season. These are corresponding graphs for the end of the season, the October period. Of particular note in the lower maps, in the maps in the bottom, is the position of the ice edge on October 1st. You can see during the early decades, the sea ice in early October, was virtually offshore of Barrow. But compared to the recent period, the sea ice is hundreds of kilometers away from Barrow, even in October. That's all that open water that is contributing to the warmer temperatures that are measured in Barrow. All of that sea ice loss has a lot to do with polar bears. It's one of the topics I study a lot. This is from a recent paper by Todd Atwood and others, just showing there's a lot more bears that are spending the summer on land now because of that sea ice loss. And there are sort of winners and losers with regard to the changes in the seasonality of the Arctic. This is showing that with earlier snow melts and earlier greening of the tundra, that really benefits the calf survival of caribou. In June, as measured on the solstice, a lot more calves are surviving in years when the snow is melted early and there's a lot of green forage available for the lactating mothers. And we'll let Chris wrap up some conclusions. Thanks.
Well, I fear we've actually gone quite long on time, so I'll leave these conclusions up. I can go through them if you like, but I'll turn it over to the organizers now.